I'd been married for almost 5 years. In the beginning, things were great. We were happy, passionate, and we shared dreams. But over time, something shifted. The once vibrant spark between us began to fade, and I found myself alone more often than I'd care to admit. My husband became distant, his attention consumed by work, projects, and endless emails. At first, I tried to fill the empty spaces with hobbies and friends, hoping he'd eventually notice, but that day never came. One evening, feeling the weight of loneliness, I wandered out to the stables. We'd owned a horse together for years. A beautiful, gentle creature who never demanded anything from me. In those quiet moments with him, I found a comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. There was something soothing in the way he greeted me with a soft nicker, how his warm breath brushed against my hands as I stroked his mane. He seemed to understand me in a way words could never convey. I told myself it was just a casual escape, a way to clear my mind, but I kept returning night after night. As the weeks passed, those simple visits turned into something else. I began to feel a strange, unexplainable attachment. Each time I saw him, my heart would flutter just a little. I felt safe, understood, almost cherished in his presence. Feelings I hadn't experienced in my marriage for a long time. There was no judgment, no expectations, just a pure, comforting connection that seemed to fill a void I couldn't ignore. But I also felt a creeping sense of guilt, something nagging at the back of my mind that reminded me this connection, no matter how innocent, was beginning to feel wrong. My husband didn't know where I was or what I was doing during those long hours. He never asked. Part of me resented him for it, but another part of me welcomed the secrecy. The more I leaned into these visits, the more I realized how distant my husband and I had become. I tried convincing myself that there was nothing unusual about my time with the horse. After all, it wasn't like I was betraying him with another person. But the emotions I was feeling, the strange affection that grew each day, left me wondering if this was as innocent as I claimed. There was an intimacy that built in silence, one that I kept tucked away from the rest of the world, even from myself. The guilt would creep in as I lay in bed at night, wondering if my heart had crossed a line. I began making excuses to go out, rearranging my schedule to have those moments alone. And each time as I walked back from the stables, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to catch me in the act. Over time, my connection with the horse grew deeper, consuming my thoughts in ways I never expected. I'd start each morning counting the hours until I could be with him again, my mind constantly drifting back to the quiet moments in the stables. It was no longer just a simple escape. It was a craving. The hours I spent grooming him, feeling the warmth of his presence, brought a peace I hadn't felt in years. It became my secret world, a place where I could let down my guard, where I felt seen, even cherished, in ways my marriage hadn't offered me in so long. I knew it was unusual, maybe even wrong, but somehow the need for that bond outweighed the guilt. It was strange how just being near him filled a void, how his silent presence seemed to understand everything I was holding inside. The more time I spent with him, the more alive I felt, even if I couldn't explain it. I'd started staying out later, sneaking out early, rearranging my life around these visits, all while hiding the truth from my husband. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a way to cope with the loneliness. After all, there was no real harm in it, right? But it wasn't just a passing fancy. I began talking to him, sharing things I couldn't say out loud to anyone else. As ridiculous as it seemed, I found myself confiding in him, telling him about my frustrations, my loneliness, and my unmet needs. In those moments, I felt a strange, almost spiritual connection. The lines blurred more each day, and I realized this wasn't just a casual affection. It was an attachment I was beginning to depend on. I found comfort in his steady gaze, a quiet assurance in the way he stood by me. It was something my husband used to offer, but that part of our relationship had become a distant memory. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line. My heart raced whenever I left the stables, the thrill mingling with guilt, knowing that my husband was oblivious to this secret side of my life. But each night as I lay beside him, I felt a hollow emptiness I could no longer ignore. With the horse it was different. There was no need to explain myself, no fear of rejection. Just a pure, uncomplicated companionship that felt closer to love than anything I'd felt in a long time. I knew deep down that this attachment couldn't last forever. It wasn't sustainable, and the guilt gnawed at me, but the thought of stopping left me feeling empty all over again. This new routine, this secret life, had become my way of coping with the reality I didn't want to face, that my marriage was falling apart. One evening as I was brushing the horse's coat, lost in my thoughts, I felt a sudden, intense presence. My heart dropped as I looked up and saw my husband standing there watching me. The shock on his face was undeniable. I froze, unable to speak as he took in the scene, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker, an accusation I couldn't quite name. I tried to explain, but the words felt clumsy, empty. How could I possibly tell him about the loneliness that had led me here, about the void that this bond had been filling? He stepped forward, his face a mixture of hurt and disbelief, and asked me what I was doing. In that moment, every secret moment I'd cherished shattered under the weight of his gaze. I could see the question in his eyes, a silent demand for an explanation I didn't know how to give. All the feelings I'd hidden, all the quiet moments I'd kept to myself were now exposed, laid bare before him. My mind raced to find a way to justify it, to make him understand that it wasn't what he thought. But even as I stumbled over my words, I knew that no explanation would make sense. He accused me, his voice laced with bitterness, of having replaced him with this animal, of finding comfort somewhere else while he was right there, unaware. Each word he spoke cut deep, not just because of the anger but because he was right in ways I hadn't even admitted to myself. This bond had become more than just a harmless escape. It had filled the cracks in my life that our relationship hadn't been able to reach. And now, seeing the pain in his eyes, I realized the true cost of my secret, of letting my feelings drift into this strange attachment. The air between us felt thick, filled with things neither of us had ever dared to say. I wanted to apologize, to make him understand, but every attempt sounded hollow. He asked if I'd ever felt the need to talk to him, if I'd ever tried to bridge the gap between us instead of seeking solace somewhere else. His words hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for, forcing me to confront the truth of my own actions. It wasn't just loneliness that had driven me to this. It was my choice to escape rather than face the reality of our failing marriage. Standing there in that painful silence, I realized how much distance I'd allowed to grow between us, how many times I'd chosen the easy way out rather than confront the issues that had been there all along. I saw the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal of realizing that he'd been left out of a part of my life he hadn't even known existed. And in that moment I felt the weight of my choices, the regret of every secret I'd kept hidden. I could feel something shattering between us, something we might never be able to rebuild. After that confrontation, an uneasy silence settled between us. Days passed, filled with a tension that lingered in every room, a weight that pressed down on us both. He barely spoke to me, his eyes distant, as if he couldn't bring himself to look at me the same way. And I, in turn, found myself lost in guilt and confusion, wondering how we'd gotten here. There was so much I wanted to say, but I didn't know where to start. Words felt useless, too small to express the complex mess of emotions I was feeling. I began reflecting on everything, on how I'd let our marriage slip into such disrepair, how I'd found comfort in the wrong place instead of reaching out to my own husband. I saw now that the bond I'd formed was just a way of filling a void, a temporary escape from the reality I didn't want to face. But it wasn't love. Not in the way I'd thought. It was a coping mechanism, a way of hiding from the issues I should have addressed with him. And now, staring at the shattered remnants of our relationship, I wished I could go back and do things differently. One evening I finally found the courage to speak. I apologized, admitting my mistakes, acknowledging the hurt I'd caused. I told him about the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, and how that had pushed me toward something I didn't fully understand. As I spoke, I saw the pain in his eyes soften, but there was still a guardedness there, a wariness that hadn't been there before. He listened in silence, his face unreadable, and I could tell he was struggling to process everything, to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the person standing before him. We spent hours talking, unraveling years of buried issues and unspoken resentments. For the first time in what felt like forever, we were honest with each other, laying bare all the things we'd avoided. There were tears, confessions, moments of raw vulnerability that left us both feeling exposed. And in those moments I realized how much I still cared for him, how much I wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. But I also knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, that trust, once broken, would take time to repair. In the days that followed, we made a choice to start over, to try and rebuild the foundation we'd let crumble. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the past would resurface, casting shadows over our attempts to move forward. But we held on, committed to the process, knowing that healing wouldn't happen overnight. And with each step I felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Looking back now, I understand how easy it is to let things slip, to find comfort in places that aren't meant to hold us. I learned the hard way that true connection requires effort, honesty, and a willingness to confront our own fears. I almost lost everything in the process, but somehow, through the pain and the regret, we found a way to start again. And for that I'll always be grateful.